The world out there is getting, well, a lot more aggressive and unpredictable. And in response to that, India's foreign policy is making a really fundamental pivot. We're seeing this major shift away from decades of a certain kind of idealism towards a new, much more hard-nosed realism. Today, we're going to break down exactly what that new playbook looks like.
So that really is the million-dollar question, right? For a rising power like India, how do you navigate a world that's just uncertain, kind of mean, and definitely risky? When all the old rules of global cooperation seem to be fraying at the edges, how do you protect your own interests and keep growing? For India, the answer seems to be a major recalibration, and it's one that's being driven almost entirely by the challenge from its biggest neighbor. And wow, this quote from India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, it just perfectly captures this new reality. This is a complete 180-degree turn from a policy that lasted for decades. For years and years, the thinking was, okay, let's manage the border dispute over here and build our economic ties over there. But now, the message couldn't be clearer. A peaceful border isn't just one part of the relationship. It is the absolute non-negotiable foundation for everything else.
So how did we get here? How did a relationship that was, filled with some cautious optimism end up in what pretty much everyone's calling a deep freeze? To really get a handle on India's new strategy, we first have to understand the breakdown that made it necessary.
And if you look at this timeline, it's pretty staggering just how fast things went south. The decade kicked off with so much hope, with this hometown diplomacy between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi. But that optimism, well, it unraveled really quickly. The Doklam standoff in 2017 was a huge warning flare. The leaders tried to put some guardrails in place with a couple of informal summits, but whatever trust was left was completely shattered in June of 2020.
Look, what happened in the Galwan Valley? This wasn't just another border scuffle. This was the first time in 45 years, 4.5 decades, that lives were lost in a direct clash between the two armies. That single event just incinerated the trust and the agreements that had somehow managed to keep the border peaceful for so long. It was a massive turning point. After that, there was just no going back to the old normal.
And from India's point of view, Galwan wasn't some random, isolated incident. They saw it as the culmination of China's repeated attempts to just unilaterally change the facts on the ground. The entire relationship, for decades, was built on these agreements to maintain peace along the border, the line of actual control. So, by amassing troops and trying to alter that status quo, China effectively tore up the very foundation of the relationship.
Okay, so faced with this brand new, much more hostile reality, what was India's move? Well, it formulated a new strategic doctrine, one that's built around three core concepts, all centered on this idea of self. And the absolute cornerstone of this new way of thinking is a concept called Atmanirbhar Bharat, which basically means a self-reliant India. Now, this became a huge policy goal in 2020. And what's really interesting is that the trigger wasn't just China. Remember the COVID-19 pandemic? It showed everyone just how fragile global supply chains were, with countries slapping on selfish export controls. The lesson was crystal clear. Being over-dependent on any one country for critical goods is a massive strategic risk.
So this big idea of self-reliance gets broken down into these three guiding principles. First up, self-reliance, Atmanirbhar, which is all about building up India's own domestic capabilities. Second, you've got self-protection, Atmaraksha, and that's laser-focused on a tough defense of its borders. And third, there's self-confidence, Atmavishwas, which is about India acting more assertively on the world stage while always preserving its own strategic autonomy and freedom of choice.
Okay, so that's the theory, but what does this doctrine actually look like on the ground? Because, a strategy is only as good as its execution. So let's dive into the concrete steps India is taking to put these ideas into action, and it's happening on a lot of different fronts.
And really, the main driver here is this idea of de-risking, from what Minister Jaishankar calls the weaponization of everything. What does that mean? It means recognizing that in the world we live in now, threats aren't just military anymore. Trade, technology, supply chains, investments, all of it can be used as a weapon, as a tool of coercion. The whole point of this three-self doctrine is to build a shield for India against exactly that kind of pressure.
So let's start with the economic front. The name of the game here is resilience. And yeah, that kicks off with trying to tackle that massive $100 billion trade deficit with China, but it goes way, way deeper. We're talking about securing supply chains for things that will define the future, like launching national missions for semiconductors. It means digital defense, like banning over 350 Chinese apps because of security concerns. It even extends to energy security, with a new push for domestic oil and gas exploration.
And wow, if you want a perfect illustration of that self-protection pillar, just look at this chart. The numbers are incredible. Between 2014 and 2022, India built almost double the length of border roads compared to the previous 6-year period. And that's because the budget for the Border Roads Organization has quadrupled. India is in a flat-out race to build up its border infrastructure so it can move troops and supplies faster than ever before.
Now, this huge push on infrastructure is happening right alongside a massive military and diplomatic effort. We're seeing a huge reorientation of the army, with divisions moving to the China border, and they're backed by serious firepower upgrades. And this is where that self-confidence piece really comes into play. India is stepping up as a defense exporter, selling its BrahMos missiles to countries like the Philippines. And at the same time, it's doubling down on partnerships with like-minded nations through groups like the Quad.
Okay, but it is so important to zoom out for a second and realize this isn't just about India and China. India's strategic shift is happening in the context of a much bigger, changing global landscape, and it has major implications for the kind of world order that's emerging.
I mean, to put it as simply as possible, what we're witnessing here is a total paradigm shift. The old way of thinking was to compartmentalize, keep the tricky border stuff in one box and let trade and everything else grow in another. The new paradigm is all about linkage. The message is there can be no business as usual, no normal relationship until and unless there's peace and tranquility on the border. It's really that simple.
Now, I want to be really clear about something. This new focus on self-reliance, this is not India pulling up the drawbridge and going back to the old days of isolationism. Not at all. In fact, you could argue it's the exact opposite. It's a strategic recalibration. The goal is to build up domestic strength, both economically and militarily, so that India can engage with the rest of the world from a much more secure and confident position. And all of this really leaves us with the big, defining question for the future. We hear this term Asian century thrown around a lot, but whether that century is peaceful and prosperous is going to be defined in large part by how its two biggest powers manage this new, much more difficult relationship. The choices they make won't just shape their own futures. They're going to help build the architecture of the new world order for all of us.